Good afternoon. I hope you're doing well. I just want to let you know that I understand if there is any frustration over the new arrangements at our school, and I will certainly do my best to be accommodating in the weeks to follow. For the rest of our time together this semester, let's attempt to keep the class structure as similar to our original style as possible. I will be recording lectures in a similar format to how we proceeded in the classroom. At the beginning of the video, I will read to you the terms that I plan to go over. These are the same terms as I used to put on the board. These terms will also be listed on our discussion board prompt. After the lecture, it is my expectation that you will take two of these terms and write a paragraph analysis about each of them. You are also expected to comment on one of the posts provided by your fellow students. In that post, you will either give insight into things that you did not previously know and found interesting, or provide further description of the term and place it within the context of the overall lecture. It is my expectation that you will not use Google to look up these terms, but rather use descriptions from within your own vocabulary and based solely on the information that I provided within my lectures. Now let me read to you the 13 terms, and if you miss any of them, don't worry, they'll be there in the discussion. First term, second phase of the Industrial Revolution. Second term, Henry Bessemer, Bessemer. Third term, secular religions. Fourth term, Beatrice Webb, W-E-B-B. Fifth term, Fabian, F-A-B-I-A-N, socialists. Sixth term, H.G. Wells. The seventh term is George Bernard Shaw. Our eighth term is the Victorian Age, which actually goes from 1837 to 1901. Our next term, number 9, is Charles Darwin. Term number 10 is T.H. Huxley. Our 11th term is German higher criticism. Our 12th term is social Darwinism. Our 13th term is made up of 3 joint terms: economic liberalism, semicolon, social Darwinism, semicolon, and imperialism. And we're going to talk about the connection between those 3 terms. Okay, when we last met in our face-to-face class, we left off, we were talking about the Second Empire, its extravagance, and then some of the criticism that Napoleon faced, both from the women in society as well as the men. Okay, now what we're going to start talking about for the second half of our course is the period roughly in Britain from around 1870 to 1900, what's frequently called the second phase of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, now you must remember that we talked before about the first phase of the Industrial Revolution. And remember, the first phase of the Industrial Revolution was based on the idea of 3 sub-revolutions. There's the Agricultural Revolution, there is the Technological Revolution, and then there's the Commercial Revolution. And that enabled England to become tremendously wealthy, the richest society of the time. Okay, now what we're talking about is at the end of the 19th century, so the period around 1870 to 1900, and that's going to be when we think of as the second phase of the Industrial Revolution. All right, let's talk about some of the differences between the second phase and the first phase. The second phase, basically we begin to see oil and gas power and eventually electric power begin replacing coal-powered energy. The machines in Britain become much larger, much faster. And there's certain inventions that we very much think about with the second phase of the Industrial Revolution. Some of the inventions, for example, would be the telegraph, the telephone, electric lights, and just try to think for a minute how this changed almost all aspects of people's lives. World became faster, deeper, more extravagant, everything kind of coming together at a faster pace. Now, just think of an invention like the electric lights. Look how this changed people's lives. Before, basically, half of the daytime was in darkness or semi-darkness. You're in the winter months, and basically from 5 o'clock on all the way till 6 or 7 o'clock the next morning, it was pretty much in darkness, and kind of limited things you can do in the dark. I'll let that slide. Okay, well, now suddenly people can work all night. They can work at night just as easily as they could during the day. Nighttime is as bright as daytime. Okay, they were accomplishing a lot more. So electric light's an important invention, and think of the telegraph. Suddenly people can communicate with people on the other side of the world. Today we take it for granted that people can do it, but at the time that was pretty remarkable. By means of something like Morse code, dots and dashes, something like that, you suddenly are communicating with people on the other side of the world. So kind of like today what we have with the 24-hour news cycle, they began having something like that for important news. You didn't have to wait 6 months any longer for a message from Europe to America. So the world became much smaller. Other inventions. Okay, one typical invention that we kind of, really take for granted today, aspirin. Now, aspirin's a miraculous invention when you think about it. Just think of how much this improved people's lives. Before that, you're in, let's say you're living in England. In England, it's either raining, about to rain, or it just finished raining. So, you pass a certain age and you're likely to have arthritis. They had, strong drugs you could take to alleviate the pain, but, sometimes it would be like trying to shoot a fly with a cannon. If it hits it, it'll work, but it's kind of overkill. Now suddenly, most mild pain, moderate pain, you can cure, relieve it with the invention of aspirin. So that certainly made people's lives much better. Now, in terms of artwork, we think of works from basically the Impressionists on, so from the late 1860s and into the 1870s, there's the invention of chemical colors. So before, very limited in the colors available. You only had a few shades of blue. Now suddenly there's over 30 different shades of blue that they can make by using chemical compositions. So that's changing people's lives. With these new inventions and colors, there was actually, in Britain, basically a color revolution, what they call a peacock revolution. Suddenly all these new colors. Before, you're in the fall, and you're in the fall, and basically you wore charcoal gray, dove gray, and then you really want to lighten up for the spring and summer. What did you do? You wore navy. Well, it's hard to get real excited over wearing the color of navy, but suddenly with all these new different kinds of colors, you can they're going to make all these different fabrics of different colors, and people are going to want to buy more fabrics, and so they're producing more goods. And because of the bigger factories and the faster, more rapid industrialization, the price of goods quickly went down. Okay, another important invention was the invention by our second term, Henry Bessemer. Okay, Henry Bessemer came up with what was called the Bessemer steel process. Now, the Bessemer steel process allowed steel to become a usable, metal in the creation of different things. So, for example, now for skyscrapers, if you made them with iron, they would have been too heavy. Iron would have been, it cracks. it rusts, and it would have been too heavy to build a skyscraper. Now suddenly in the 1880s, they can make skyscrapers. So as more and more people are moving into the cities, or as they called the cities at the time, and we still sometimes think of the cities by these terms, the metropolis, think of New York. What do they call that museum there at 86th Street and Fifth Avenue? The Met, or the Metropolitan Museum. What is the fantastic opera house there at Lincoln Center? The Metropolitan Opera House. So metropolitan referring to the idea of the metropolis, the really big city. Okay, so partly because of this invention by Henry Bessemer, they start making skyscrapers, and they start making also conveyor belts in the factories that allow for much more rapid kinds of industrialization. So, really a fascinating and important invention. Now, there's also going to be at the time people believing in the idea of unlimited progress. Basically, people feeling that anything that people put their minds to, they could solve. Now, do you think we have that same optimism today? Some people are going to say yes, some people are going to say no. I think at this point in time, particularly with the recent events, probably most of us would say no. And just think of all these, horrible events we've had, such as Superstorm Sandy. Do we really feel we could conquer nature? No. So we feel that there's kind of limits. But at the time, they didn't feel that way. They felt anything they put their minds to can be solved. Now, what gave them this optimism? The idea that they saw all these fascinating and, to them remarkable inventions. And, we indeed do have some remarkable inventions. Some of them, just think of our iPods, our iPads, our smartphones. You have so much in just a tiny little thing weighing, 5 or 6 ounces. It's really remarkable. Or we have people living into their 80s commonly today. It's not a rare thing to hear of people living into their 80s. Before, that was something, inconceivable. Okay, so there are some remarkable inventions today as well. Well, we're also going to see during this period of the last third of the 19th century, the beginnings of what are called, this is our term number 3, secular religions. Now, when you think about the term secular religion, that's kind of a strange term. Now, let's think for a minute why. Okay, it's an oxymoron. Secular refers to non-religious. Religions refer to religious. So how can you have a non-religious religion? Well, some examples of some non-religious religions would be Marxism, or a belief in science. So they're called a secular religion because a secular religion really is referring to a religious-like belief in secular things. And when you think about that, that's something totally, different than the way we would usually think of religion. So secular religions mean a non-religious religion, or a religious-like devotion towards non-religious things. So some of the things that they became interested in was not traditional religion, but spirituality, seances, the exotic, even things like, as I said, Marxism or science. Some people believed Marxism had the answers to everything. Others said science would have the answers to everything, that science is empirical, science is rational. So if we would just follow a scientific belief, everything would be fine. Now, during this period of the last third of the 19th century, we're also going to see a strong belief in volunteerism. They believed, instead of spending all their time in church, that they would be glorifying God more by doing a religious-like devotion towards helping others. So we see that, for example, in a movement called our fourth term here, Fabian socialism. Okay, now Fabian socialism, this term means it's a distinctly English form of socialism. It's sometimes seen as a gentlemanly socialism or an armchair socialism. So a gentleman of leisure, sitting in a tufted leather easy chair and debating ideas of the time. So, but at the same time trying to make things better for others. Now, another part of Fabian socialism, and why it's called Fabian socialism, is it's referring to an emperor of ancient Rome called Fabius. Now, Fabius was known for a slow and gradual kind of social reform. So unlike Marxism, which is referring to rapid social upheaval and the idea of one class in conflict with another, going from place to place to place till they take over the world, Fabian socialism is socialism coming from the top down. So rich people deciding what is best to do to help those in need, but for the first time really caring about those in need. Now, one of the leading Fabian socialists and one of the founders of the Fabian socialist movement in Britain is going to be our next term. This is our term number 5, Beatrice Webb. So Beatrice Webb starts the Fabian socialist movement in Britain, and she's going to be known for what are called her little suppers, or sometimes also called her Tuesday night suppers. And here's how she tried to make the world a better place. Okay, first of all, Beatrice Webb came from a very wealthy background. I believe she was married to a viscount. And, basically she lived in the West End of London. Now, the West End of London is going to be the, where probably if anyone going to London, nowadays they would probably want to spend most of their time in the West End. The West End is where all the shows are, the museums are, the great shopping, the nice restaurants, the best hotels. Now the opposite of the West End is going to be the East End. Now, at this time, between the period of 1870 and 1900, the people of one class had no mixing with people of another class. So if you were rich, you didn't know anyone poor. If you were poor, you didn't know anyone rich. They were completely separated, both in terms of socialization and in terms of where they lived. Okay, now the East End and the West End are not that far apart, somewhere in the vicinity of 9 or 10 miles. Now, Beatrice Webb became almost like a cultural anthropologist, and what she did was she went from her, wealthy home in Belgravia in the West End over to the East End, and she observed the people of the East End, almost seeing them like animals in a zoo. And she saw their style of living and their attitudes completely different than anyone she knew. So she observed them and took notes about them. What did she find out about these poor people? She found out they were living in atrocious conditions there in the East End of London. For example, they were living in places that had no roofs, places that had no toilets, places that had no one supporting them. They had places where men were alcoholics. They came back and beat their wives. Women ran out on their husbands and became prostitutes to earn a little extra money. They saw basically people giving up on life and just not knowing what to do. And with a whole lot of human compassion, she decided what can be done to make their lives better. Now, this is a completely seismic shift from the way things were earlier in the century. Earlier in the century, remember, they had the ideas, this is a big part of England, remember coming all the way from Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, the idea of laissez-faire, or a leave-it-alone economic philosophy. So based on the idea that if you were poor, it was your problem, your fault, and it was not the government's problem to take care of you or to do anything to make your life better. People were basically being blamed for being poor. She begins to have a new conception and said, what can our wealthy society do to make things better for those in need? So what is she going to do? She starts forming the Fabian Socialist movement, and she starts throwing her Tuesday night suppers as a way of bringing people into her home on Tuesday night and wining them and dining them. So they have a 5-course meal with lots of wine. Then, as they're about to break up for the evening, the men go into a drawing room and smoke cigars and drink brandy and talk about money. And the women go into another room, do needlepoint, drink sherry, and talk about babies and babies' clothes. She says, stop. Before we separate, let's thank God for divine providence and the fact that we're living this wonderful life. And they're all, here, here, cheers to divine providence, cheers. Then she says, now let me tell you about Mrs. Jones, who lives in the East End. And then she goes into a lot of detail about the life of Mrs. Jones. And just as people are feeling so bad about Mrs. Jones, she then turns up the pressure and makes it even worse and says, but Mrs. Jones has it good because her husband at one time had a job and he doesn't drink, so he doesn't come and beats me. But Mrs. Smith has it even worse. So, she gets them to care about the poor. She bases the idea that if rich people, and particularly leaders of government, hear about the problems of the poor, they're going to want to make the lives of the poor better. So she's basing it upon the idea that it's not that rich people hate the poor, but it's that they just can't identify with them or know anyone poor. So she starts this movement, and this movement, the Fabian Socialist movement, is going to have some very well-known people in England coming from mostly the upper middle class and the upper class. And there's going to be a lot of very famous writers associated with the Fabian Socialist movement. Now, one very famous writer, which I think, particularly here at Del Valle, you're really going to, have heard of and, probably like, H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells, or Herbert George Wells, was a famous sci-fi writer. So he uses science fiction as a way of dealing with social problems. All right, now there's some, very famous books by H.G. Wells. Think of any books you know by H.G. Wells. So The Time Machine, The War of the Worlds, several other books. The Invisible Man. So, many great works of science fiction. Well, he comes up with this interesting idea of using sci-fi as a way of getting people to identify and want to become involved in Fabian socialist causes. Now, why would he use that means of communication? It seems kind of strange. Why not write a polemic? Why not write a philosophical argument about why the poor need to be helped? Well, can you think why? Well, probably at least part of the reason why is because people aren't going to read it. How much philosophy do people read for fun? Do you've had a couple weeks off, have you been reading any Wittgenstein or Schopenhauer? My guess is no, and I definitely haven't. Okay, but science fiction, it comes alive. So it's a way of dealing with social problems, but making them more accessible and more, something you're going to care more about. Okay, so he's also an interesting figure himself. He was very much a man ahead of his times. For example, H.G. Wells was a firm believer in equality between the sexes. Now, we've talked before about how little opportunities women had in this society and the strong misogyny, dislike or hatred of women that was so much a part of 19th century culture. We talked before, remember, in the 19th century, they call relations between men and women the battle of the sexes. And basically, that's the way they envisioned relations between the sexes as a battle, that they're each gaining something from it and that they don't really understand or like each other. Well, he was very much ahead of his time because he was a strong proponent, H.G. Wells, in something called free love. Well, free love would today be a friends with benefits relationship. So the idea that you like someone or love someone, you sleep with someone, you live with someone as long as you want to. You don't have to be married to do that. And, each party can walk out on the other if they get tired of the relationship with the other, or they meet someone they like better, or their needs or desires change. Now, today we take it for granted. Most people are going to live with the person they love long before they make the decision to marry them. But at the time, that was seen as a shocking idea. So he was very much, ahead of his time in his conception of, total equality between the sexes. He was also a strong proponent in vegetarianism. Now, once again, today, once again, it's going to depend where you live. Certainly easier to find good vegetarian restaurants in places like California than in, beef country like Nebraska. But, the idea of vegetarianism today is seen as a choice. Notice even at Del Val, the place that has always vegetarian entrees every single meal, as well as a pretty good salad bar. But at the time, it was something completely shocking. People basically were seeing the meat and the starch as the important part of the meal. The vegetables were like a minor part of it. It would be like going to the Palm, a great steakhouse, and saying, I don't really care about the 2-pound porterhouse. All I really like to go there for is the parsley on the plate. Okay, so that's the way vegetarianism was seen at the time. So he was very much ahead of his time. Okay, another famous Fabian socialism, so interested in social reforms and making things better for those in need, was the famous Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw, our next term. Okay, so term number 7 is George Bernard Shaw. Now, Shaw wrote over 100 different plays, so kind of amazing how much people of the time accomplished. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 of his plays. Okay, one of his plays is called Pygmalion, spelled Pygmalion. Now, Pygmalion basically becomes in America My Fair Lady. And My Fair Lady talks about differences of class. And it basically, what it shows is the idea that the rich and the poor are not really different than one another. The rich are just luckier. It's basically showing that poor people could pass themselves off as rich people if they had the proper training, if they knew how to speak correctly, if they had the money to travel, if they had the money to present themselves in upper class clothing. So it's not that the rich people were better than the poor, but it's that they were just more fortunate than the poor. Okay, so Pygmalion by Shaw, and then becoming My Fair Lady in America. And, definitely a play that you would want to see. It's one of, the greatest plays of all times. Okay, now another play was a very courageous play that George Bernard Shaw wrote called Mrs. Warren's Profession. Now, Mrs. Warren's Profession is dealing with the world's oldest profession. No, not winemaking, but rather prostitution. Now, that was a very controversial topic, and in some places today it still is. Once again, it's dealing with gender differences and gender power. Now, instead of showing women as being the weak ones in society, the disadvantaged, it instead shows men having the real power. It shows that the women having the real power. The men are shown as weak. They're so desperate for sex that they'll give up anything, where the women are just kind of laughing at them that they're so desperate for sex and they'll give up anything for it, where the woman just lies there and is basically counting down till the man's done and they can count their money. So it shows that the women have the real power. Now, Shaw admitted in the liner notes to this play that it was, later on he's saying that it was a good thing he wrote this early on in his career. He wouldn't have had the audacity to write it later. When you're earlier on in your career, you don't have that much to lose. You're much more willing to take chances. But it's dealing with, very controversial subjects. So Pygmalion and Mrs. Warren's Profession by Shaw.